I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me to introduce our keynote speaker, Clara Han. I say Clara, I should say Clara probably, but Clara Han. An associate professor of anthropology and the co-director of both the program on racism, immigration, and citizenship, and the critical global health seminar at Johns Hopkins University, and the holder of both a PhD and an MD from Harvard University. She is an intellectual of uncommonly wide-ranging interests and skills, as well as, evidently, a very busy woman. Dr. Han's anthropological work, which clusters around the themes of poverty, disease, and illness, care, and violence, reflects her range. Her first ethnography, which is entitled Life in Debt, Times of Care and Violence in Neoliberal Chile, is an ethnography of a low-income neighborhood called La Pincoya in Santiago, Chile. And Santiago, of course, is the capital of Chile and also the largest. I think it's about half the population of Chile is in Santiago. This ethnography is an extraordinary rendering of the quotidian intimacies of care and intricate relations of indebtedness among both kin and neighbors, especially women, in this neighborhood in a country that understands itself as a model of neoliberalism. So Chileans often say we are the modelo, the model of neoliberalism. In this ethnography, she performs the feat of working through complex bodies of theory, as well as recognizing structural determinants of inequality and the violences they exert, primarily through really beautiful ethnographic storytelling, which is a feat that anthropologists often aspire to, but rarely are able to achieve. So that's really beautiful stuff. Her current work ranges farther afield in several senses. She's beginning to work on Korea and on childhood, I understand, and is engaged in an impressive variety of collective projects, including the 2015 tome entitled Living and Dying in the Contemporary World, a compendium, pretty big topic, which she co-edited with Lina Das, and a forthcoming co-edited special issue of How Journal entitled Anthropology and Life Itself. Again, pretty big topic, which I look forward to seeing. But she's also returned to her longstanding field site in Santiago, I think. You're back in La Pincoya? In what? It's actually a different neighborhood. Okay, but in Santiago, to examine the reverberations of a single death in a context where violence has long been understood as massive and spectacular. Her ethnography of that project is currently underway, and her talk for us today, which is entitled Echoes of a Death and the Life Story, will, I believe, give us a taste of what is to come. Welcome to York University, Clara, and thank you so much for being here.
So thanks so much for that introduction, and I also wanted to thank Linda Peak for extending the invitation to participate in this conference with you all, as well as Leanne Bennett, who was really, really helpful in organizing the entire conference, and also just to make sure that I kind of stayed on track. It was a really interesting morning. I think that some of the questions that that emerged in the discussion this morning are some of the issues that I will also discuss throughout the talk. You might see it a little bit more like kind of not as marked out for you through the ethnography, but you will see the themes, particularly around the question of care in relation to a model of politics, and how we might actually think through the feminine as a way to know and study the urban differently. And just in terms of just one tiny point I actually wanted to kind of bring up, and this will be something that will come out in the talk, is to think about perhaps not the poor as a particular category of people that embody the purity of spirit of the proletariat, but rather to think about the kind of bitter compromises that people in conditions of poverty make. So we might, rather than thinking of, where we might kind of privilege and think about these practices of the otherwise that kind of yield a completely different world, we might also think about the ways in which people in contexts of poverty take part in what Asif Bayat calls a quiet politics of the ordinary, in which the norm is slowly shifted. So these are the kinds of questions that I've also been committed to. So the talk actually draws from a larger book project, Echoes of a Death, and I'll just start reading because we're short on time. So this is the first section, is life story. How do we relate a life in ethnography? Or in what way does relating a death help us describe a life differently? In this paper, I describe how the death of a young man reverberated in a low-income neighborhood in Santiago. I do so by relating the affects surrounding the young man's absence and visit in dreams, and the accompanying stories of visits from the dead that these affects were part and parcel of. In so doing, I also attempt to describe a method of coming to relate a life and a death in ways that depart from the life history method or the genre of the life story. Rather than attempt to construct the biography of an individual, the labor of ethnographic description here is to allow oneself to hear the echoes of a death in the lives of others. It is through being taken up by echoes, some resonant, some dissonant, among lives proximate to each other, that we might come to see how the death of an individual relates to a death. An individual's life relates to a life. The life story or life history method is a classic genre within anthropology in which the biography of the individual is reconstructed as a lens onto history, as well as a window onto the way in which individuals engage existing social norms. Sidney Mintz's life history of Don Tasso, a cane worker in Puerto Rico, in some ways exemplifies this genre. For Mintz, Don Tasso's life runs parallel to history, conveying to the reader, quote, in an individual way, the collective experience of a conquered people, is his words. In this life history that, quote, eventuates in being history, Don Tasso's biography is chronologically ordered by Mintz in line with the transformation of Barrio Oaxaca and the wider political economy of Puerto Rico. For João Biel, an anthropologist who has worked extensively on questions of abandonment in Brazil, this narrative structure of the life story, with its emphasis on a unified narrative self and as window onto larger historical transformations, becomes a route through which the anthropologist is able to bring an individual relegated to social death, quote, out of forgetfulness. Those are his words. Biel encounters Catarina in a place called Vita, a place where the old, mad, and disabled are, quote, sent to die. Like Mintz with Don Tasso, Biel is taken by the sense that Catarina was exceptional or ordinary, or extraordinary, in that, quote, she stood out in that context of annihilation. She refused to be reduced to her physical condition and fate. However, while Mintz creates a chronologically ordered biography, Biel engages in what we might call a work of testimony. That I'm saying is a legal apparatus of testimony, institutional apparatus of testimony, of pairing Catarina's words with other forms of evidence, records from the psychiatric hospital, the universal healthcare system, as well as interviews with her family members whom he tracks down. To confirm and corroborate Catarina's words, what Biel likens to, quote unquote, detective work. Quote, but both Catarina's efforts, as desperate as they were creative, to write herself back into people's lives, and the anthropologist's attempt to support her search for consistency in demands for a possibility other than Vita, are documented here. Through this detective work, the individual is recuperated. Her words are given coherence by being corroborated by documentary evidence. And she is, in a sense, given a place through his writing, placed back within the family and the city-state that had let her die. The momentum of the narrative is generated through this recuperative work, accumulating evidence and words, matching them, the anthropologist returning to Catarina as she emerges through this labor as the individual protagonist. But is there a way to describe a life in a way that does not reconstitute the individual, while still acknowledging the importance of the specificity of that life? We could also ask, for example, what if Catarina had just been mad, right? The neighborhood. So let me return to Echoes of a Death. This paper draws from fieldwork in a low-income neighborhood in Santiago, which has been under police occupation for 15 years, and which is marked by economic deprivation, underground economies of drug trafficking and theft, and incarceration. One of the women I first encountered was Martita. A few months before I had met her, her son Camilo had been killed by the Anti-Narcotics Brigade of Police Investigations during a drug raid in the neighborhood. I had not anticipated to have my fieldwork taken up by the reverberations of this death, but in a sense, my very movement in the neighborhood to even discover what the boundaries of neighborhood were made possible by Martita, her network of kin and neighbors, what I came to think of as the, quote, network of embraces by women. And I want to actually just mark this out as a kind of different way of approaching the problem also of drug trafficking, which I would argue is dominated by a masculine perspective that focuses primarily on competing claims to sovereignty over territory exerted either by the state or drug trafficking groups. Okay, so what I came to think of as the network of embraces by women that allowed me to work in a volatile setting in which death and injury from bullets are contended with every day. The risks to all are real and not just the paranoia on the part of an outsider. And in which the air is thick with rumors and gossip, swirls of stories and affects, context that was not only often inaccessible to me, but at times was inaccessible to those who live there. The network of embraces allowed me to walk, to listen. Thus, the scale of my study was the neighborhood, as Richard Reckman remarks, quote, "The real collective level of lives as lived is not a construction, it is a fact. The neighbors, the relatives, the people you live with, they share the same space, breathe the same air, live the same contradictions, and so on. They are affected, even if differently, by the same things." Through this ethnography of a neighborhood, I was carried by the echoes of Camilo's death in lives proximate to him. His mother, his daughter, who was born after he was killed, girlfriend, the mother-in-law, and other extended kin, neighbors, as well as in the proximity of state institutions, specifically in a municipal office dedicated to representing victims of violent crime, with those police who rotated through the territory that marked out the neighborhood as a unit of state administration, and more distantly with human rights lawyers in the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of the Interior, and with the clinicians at the psychiatric hospital and private clinics where some of my friends received treatment for depression, heart disease, and diabetes. At the same time, I was simply being taken up in the flux of everyday life, sitting with Martita at her home, spending time with her daughter-in-law and granddaughters, with her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter in a house that they shared with her mother, father, grandparents, and siblings, accompanying them to the cemetery, hanging out in Martita's storefront where she had run a fast food shop with her son until his death, taking in the sun with the neighbors, selling kebabs to raise money for adult diapers and sour cream for a neighbor's son, quadriplegic after a gunshot wound to the neck. It dawned on me much later, after returning to Baltimore and having needed some years to find a footing in this fieldwork, that these echoes were bundled or resounded in other stories surrounding death. The dead, betrayals, and the poisons of kinship, as well as human rights and the justice system, to name a few of the issues are at stake here. In sitting with these echoes and these reverberations in other stories, I have found Veena Das's writing on the stories of illness in low-income neighborhoods in Delhi to be particularly helpful. Stories of illness here, quote, were not clear-cut in terms of plot, narrative coherence, or delineation of characters. Stories could change shape, be picked up or discarded, in part the very strangeness of the world for the poor and the sheer force of contingency produced constant shifts in delineating of character and plot. Distinguishing these stories from those of fiction, in which plot, quote, refers to the series of events consisting of an outline of action or of a narrative, Das suggests a different meaning of plot, such as ground, quote, the soil on which the story grows. Can we also consider the ways in which stories surrounding a death might provide the plot for that life? Let me explore this through the quotidian talk of visits from the dead in dreams. Dreams are imprinted by the milieu, the pursuing of justice, the pressures around the drug economy, and the relationship to the law for those who live in the neighborhood, as well as the violence and corrosion in kinship. Taken up in the flux of everyday life, I followed the drift of talk of dreams and visits from the dead that bubbled up while I spent time with Martita, her extended kinship network, her friends and neighbors. I came to listen to the talk of dreams not as symptoms of internal conflicts, right, so not within a psychological framework, but rather that which allows for the speaking of difficult kinship relations, knotted as they were both with the aspirations to justice for sons who had been killed at the hands of the police, as well as with the vulnerability that comes with living under the shadow of criminalization. Through the talk of dreams, we may see the ways in which politics encompasses the domestic. That is, aspirations to justice are not mutually exclusive from the concreteness of care. Right? So this is really important distinction and question here around the theories of justice versus the ethics of care, right? And actually, how do we think about the ways in which the politics is embedded in the domestic? That is, so rather, justice comes to be unevenly tied into the care and violence within the domestic. Okay, the next section is elsewhere in relations. Every night before going to bed, Martita kisses her hand and pressed it to the photo of her son, a large poster that hung in the back of the storefront, illuminated day and night by track lights and electric candles. Que duermas bien, te quiero, like, so sleep well, I love you. As we spent time together, I began to catch Martita's anxieties surrounding her son. Was he resting in heaven peacefully, struggling here on earth? Why had he not come to visit in dreams? These anxieties seemed to surface when other stories of visits from the dead bubbled up in encounters between neighbors. Walking by Martita's house, Soledad stopped to greet Martita through the bars of the storefront, where we were looking out onto the street, watching women go to and fro running errands, kids running around with pet dogs. Martita introduced me to Soledad, telling me that Soledad's son had also been killed by the police. Soledad continued the sentence, quote, 2 years, she said 2 years ago. She turns to Martita. I dreamed with my son last night. So it's like soñar con, like I dreamed. It says that actually like the dead present themselves in dreams. I dreamed with my son last night. There are only a few times that I dreamed with him. Yes, one time I dreamed with him right when he was killed by the Carabineros, that is the branch of military police that does street patrols. He was lying in bed and sleeping. I saw his face clean, beautiful. There was his smile, and I said, good, my son is resting. Martita responds, I dreamed with Camilo one time, but he was not sleeping. I was talking with him. He was seated here, and she points to one of the plastic green chairs in the storefront. I said, Camilo, you need to take care when you walk in the street. You need to take care. And he listened to me and said, yes, mama. Martita turns to me to mention that Soledad's son's case is being taken up by the same lawyer in what she calls the Corporación de Derechos Humanos, like the Corporation for Human Rights, but of the municipality. But actually, this is where was interesting, is that she herself is piecing together a knowledge of the bureaucratic legal institutions that are helping her. So she actually she's just coming to know what these terms are, right? In fact, it was actually the assistance to victims of violent crime that was administered by the National Fund for Public Security, created by the president, Sebastián Piñera. Martita alternates between calling this lawyer el fiscal, the public prosecutor, which is different than this lawyer, and el abogado, the lawyer, saying that he's good, very good. Soledad takes Martita's hand in hers, quote, is that I don't focus too much on this process. I just let it go on by itself, because it's slow, because it is military justice. I need to continue, that is to say, if it's a branch of the Carabineros, that, if the military police killed you, you go into the military justice system, right? I need to continue on with life. I cannot stay on top of them, that is to say, stay on top of the case. One loses time. It's that more than earthly justice, I say there is divine justice. I say that God judges all. Because of this, I feel tranquility, because I don't believe in the justice below on earth. I believe in divine justice, in God. Soledad's words seem to resonate with what anthropologist Samina Mullah finds in her work with rape victims who do not pursue their case through the criminal justice system, and instead voice what is important, rather than the call for justice, what is important, just living, securing livelihoods that take them out from under forms of masculine care. Yet for Martita, Camilo's absence of visits and dreams seemed to be related to a deep anxiety around the state of Camilo's soul, which she saw as intertwined with both pursuing justice and the corrosiveness of kinship. As she later said to me, was Camilo unable to rest? Was he still on the earth because of cosas pendientes, pending things? Is this why Camilo has not visited me? It was June, a cold winter day. The gray sky is pressing in on me on all sides. A feeling of suffocation comes and goes, accompanied by a recurring image of my hair suddenly going completely white as I turn the corner to the central street of the neighborhood, the street where Martita lives. She's waiting for me at her house so we can drive down to her friend Blondie's house a few blocks down, where we would take evening tea. We sit at Blondie's kitchen table smoking cigarettes. Her partner Nestor brings back sliced ham and bread, which we take with our tea. The TV is on in the living room where Nestor's brother was stretched out watching a reality TV show. Martita has been sick all day. Her stomach hurts por los nervios, because of her nerves. As she takes tea, her eyes seem to be closing every now and then, as if she were about to fall asleep. She tells Blondie that her estranged husband's sister had, quote, went to see a woman, and this woman said that Camilo is doing well. What do you think? She asked Blondie. Martita is voicing a nagging anxiety that started to crystallize last night with the news of a medium having made contact with Camilo. The night before, when Martita and I were visiting her daughter-in-law Ana and her granddaughter Vivi, this is the Camilo's daughter who had been born after he was killed, Ana tells her that Don Pedro, the estranged husband, had arrived to visit the granddaughter, recounting the story of the woman from Maipú, this neighborhood in Santiago, who had seen Camilo, the medium, and to whom Camilo had said he was well. Martita is clearly disturbed, her face darkening, even as she switches the conversation to small talk and to focusing on her granddaughter Vivi. Yet as we were about to take our leave from their house, Ana's grandmother reiterates the same story of the medium. Martita responds tersely, "I don't believe in those stupid things. Camilo didn't even know them, like that, the paternal side of the family." Ana also reiterates that Camilo did not even know them. The grandmother insists, "But it's the woman who comes on the TV in the morning and can communicate with the dead, see?" On television, every major channel has a program dedicated to communication with the dead. Medium, the psychic, these shows are alternatively framed around the forensics of the death, so that the dead can tell what exactly happened to them, but also framed around the untimely death, so that the relatives have a chance to anticipate the death of the dead again, right? To say their goodbyes and know that they are now resting in heaven, having now had the chance to leave the world well. Martita just looks at her. The grandmother says, "Yes, okay. Ciao, ciao, Martita," looking like she knows that she's offended Martita. Martita's words, "Camilo didn't even know them," that side of the family, that paternal side of the family, seems to show the struggle over defining the dead's place within kinship relations. Who claims the dead as our own? But the surfacing of the story again to Blondie, bundled together with Martita's nerves, also reveal the uncertain status of the dead. Did she really make contact? Is he well? Is he suffering? Blondie responds to Martita, "Look, why did she, the estranged husband's sister, present herself to this woman? The truth would be revealed if you were to present yourself to this woman, to the medium. No, in reality, that which is most truthful is to dream with him, that he presents himself directly to you in your dream. Maybe he doesn't want to bother you because he knows that you are putting so much effort in for him. And when justice arrives, it's possible that he arrives too, that he gives thanks for having fought so much. You are Christian. You need to think that he is well because he is in heaven. Those who are on earth, we are the ones who suffer. They crush us. I don't know. I believe so much in my God." She turns to recount the stories of her father's visits in her dream. "Let me recount to you. A few days after the death of my father, I dreamed with him. I was in a train with all of the seats here, here, and here. Above, I see a train car with cows, animals full of fruits. My father was sitting just a bit in front. I approach him. 'Papa, where are you living? Where are you going?' 'Hija, I'm living across the street from you.' 'Hey, Papa, should I buy you some fruit so you can have it at your house?' 'Don't worry, hija, I am well and I have everything I need.' And he did this to me, passed me on the shoulder. So I knew that he was in heaven. But with my siblings, he was seated at the edge of the bed, each one of them, and said to them, 'Why did you kill me, you and your sister? You killed me, you and your sister.'" Blondie then describes the agonizing battle over the care of her father, as he was dying of esophageal cancer, interlacing dreams with her father with a recounting of betrayals and poison in her kinship relations. "My father had cancer. When he was diagnosed, I dreamed with him. He visited me, although he was still alive. He said he didn't want to be operated on. 'If I am operated on, I will die in 5 days,' he said." Blondie took her father to the Institute of Cancer, where they received a further diagnosis of metastatic cancer. The physicians told her that there was no treatment possible, but she asked the doctors to tell him that they could indeed operate on him so that he could continue on with hope. They returned home, and Blondie cared for him. But one day when Blondie was not at home, her older brother and sister took her father back to the house that he had shared with his wife, where her older sister, her sister's partner, and children lived. Quote, "They didn't let me enter the house. I saw him only through the window. From outside, I waved to him. 'Papa, are you okay?' From a neighbor, however, she had heard that her siblings had taken her father to the hospital to be operated on to receive essentially a GI tube for feeding. They did it secretly. They operated on my father." And she grabs her head with her hands. "No, I told all my siblings, my father will die in 5 days because you operated on him. It's your fault." Her father was brought back to her older sister's house after the operation, but required hospitalization a day after he returned. In which he was hospitalized for pneumonia, which Blondie attributes to their care of him. Quote, "They put him in the bathtub and they gave him a bath. Because of this, I say that my older sister deserves to be in prison." Following his death, the siblings were caught within another fight over the father's burial. Although her father had told Blondie that he wanted to be buried in the earth, Blondie's older sister had bought a, quote, what she called a luxury coffin, and had insisted that he be placed in a concrete niche, as the, quote, coffin would not last long if it were buried in the earth. Compelled by her sisters, Blondie went into debt to buy the niche, but her sisters kept the keys, such that when she visits her father in the cemetery, she can only remain outside. Quote, when I visit him, I bring scotch tape and tape flowers on the windows of the niche, but my siblings keep taking down all the flowers. A few months prior, Blondie's sister was arrested for drug trafficking when her house was raided by the police. She invited me to the sentencing hearing of her sister. After the sentencing of 5 years was announced by the judge, Blondie was shaking, confronting the public prosecutor and telling him that drugs had been planted in her sister's house. Blondie's mother, upon hearing the news of her sister's sentence, went, in Blondie's words, se volvió loca, she went crazy, becoming childlike from one day to the next, unable to feed or bathe herself, and needing adult diapers. With the incarceration of her sister, Blondie found herself not only nursing her mother, but also drawn into a closer but possibly more suffocating relationship with her sister. Calling her from prison, her sister pleads with her to visit, to bring her soap, shampoo, food, and clothes. She repents to Blondie for a latticework of betrayals that define their sisterhood and their place of their relation within the larger kinship network. Her daughter, the sister's daughter, who seduced Blondie's partner, who momentarily abandoned Blondie and their children for the teenager while she turned a blind eye. Her collusion with her older brother to cut out Blondie from the decision-making over her father's course of treatment and the arrangements for his funeral. Blondie begins to visit her sister each week in the prison, although she tells me she dreads it, and all the time she sits across from her sister, she says, quote, I don't speak to her. I transmit everything through my eyes. All the hatred that she did to me, I transmit back to her. As if attempting to disentangle herself from her sister, but failing to do so, she reiterates to me on various occasions, quote, I swear to you, I don't feel pain for her. Yet each week she is compelled to visit. It's something that is born of me. Algo que me nace, it's just born of me. She tells me of another dream. I dreamed with my papa. I was walking down the street with my sister. I see my father. He was looking at me from afar, but my sister didn't see him. I said to my sister, Papa is there. And she said to me, Shh, I don't see anything. But I saw him, and it's because he is protecting me, and only me, not my sister. I pray to my father that he protect me. My sister prays as well. She asks him, please get me out of here, out of prison. But she cannot dream with him. The visits of Blondie's father in dreams are part and parcel of the milieu in which Blondie lives. And yet in the anxieties around these visits and their status as dreams, they seem to signal a profound sense of the precariousness of reality itself. As is well known, Freud saw the dream as a site of psychic struggle within the unconscious of the individual, such that the hidden or latent content of the dream is deciphered through the manifest content. Inheriting this psychic struggle within Islamic metaphysics, Stefania Pandolfo explores the dream as a, quote, other scene, another locality or an elsewhere that is the intermediary zone between the dead and the living, in which the soul is disengaged from the person during sleep and enters into contact with things past and things to come, and which, according to Lacan, is, quote, a boundary zone in which the subject is knocked. A certain beyond makes itself felt. It makes itself felt when the subject is not at home, when it travels outside beyond any possible autobiographical reappropriation to the only place where, paradoxically, it can be at home, but in the mode of absence. Here in the field of the dream, you are at home. In her study of the interpretation of visitational dreams, in which the dead visit the living, Amira Mittermeier explores the dream as a site of ethics, in which, quote, moral dispositions, feelings, and obligations come through dreams. Tying together sleep and waking, night and day, the dream, quote, instructs the dreamers how to act in their daily lives. Visitational dreams have the status of truth, quote, the words of the dead in dreams are always true because they reside in the realm of truth. Thus the dreams put forth, quote, moral imperatives. They can be binding and obliging. Dreams can do things and make the dreamers do things. Mittermeier shows this through cases in which the visits from the dead compel one to pray for the dead, give alms, or to emulate them in terms of living a pious life. In Blondie's recounting of the visits of her father in dreams that are told within the context of the violence of kinship relations and the suffocating concreteness of care for her imprisoned sister. However, a different route or an imagination of elsewhere reveals itself, as well as a different sense of, quote, truth, it reveals itself as well. This elsewhere resides not in an outside or beyond the everyday, but is tucked within everyday life itself, in the dark nooks and crannies of kinship relations, contiguous with or folded into the time and place of everyday life. I might say it's a different modality of everyday life. The visits from the dead in dreams authorize the real, allowing for the betrayals and existential threats of kinship to be voiced to specific others, such as intimate friends, and to oneself. We see these struggles over the authorization of the real in Blondie's agonizing account of the bitter fights over her father's care in the dying space, over the siblings' conflicting visions of when and how to let go, and over what the father's desires are in relation to living, dying, and his death. This is why I see visits from the dead in terms of a precariousness of reality, and not simply just a site where you achieve home, right? In which the tussle over the real is embedded in one's being in kinship, with all of the contradictory impulses that kinship entails. Here, in contrast to a view of dreams as issuing forth clear-cut moral imperatives in relation to a, quote, good life, or having the status of an unshakable truth, the dream mirrors, or better yet, is entangled with an everyday in which ethics encompasses, quote, our life as a whole, in Cora Diamond's words. As I came to see with Martita and her friends and extended kin, whose sons too had been killed by police, the dream as a modality of everyday life, which conveys the precariousness of reality, gave expression to the ways in which hopes for justice were entangled with bitter compromises in kinship. In the case of Blondie's father, the struggles over the authorization of the real occur within the context of the illness experience, in which dying and illness destabilize taken for granted social categories. In the case of Martita and Beatriz, the mother of Camilo's girlfriend, Ana, we see how state violence and violence in the domestic are aspects of the same milieu. So this is justice in the tangle of kinship. Nearly every afternoon or evening, Martita visited her granddaughter, Vivi, spending time with Camilo's partner, Ana, Ana's mother, Beatriz, her sister and her sister's boyfriend, and Ana's grandparents. 2 months before Camilo was killed by police investigations, Ana's older brother, Nestor, was killed by the carabineros when he was caught stealing tires off cars in a high-income neighborhood. As Beatriz related to me, this is the mother of Nestor, the mother of Ana, Camilo's partner, right? As Beatriz related to me, Nestor had borrowed an internet company van that his friend used and was loading tires in the van when the carabineros stopped him. Although he had come out of the van with his arms up in the air, the carabineros fired on him, shooting him in the abdomen. A woman in a high-rise building took a video of the shooting, in which Nestor, lying on the ground and bleeding out, grabbed the leg of the carabineros officer who was standing over him, seeming to plead for help. But the carabineros officer shook his leg of the grasp, watching Nestor bleed to his death. Nestor and Camilo were buried next to each other with a shared tombstone on which their photos in a double frame rest in a double frame with a hinge. The case of Beatriz's son was to be taken up by a law clinic, a university law clinic, but they rarely communicated with her on the status of the legal case, giving Beatriz the sense that her son's case was constantly under threat of dissolution, or that may not have even had a chance to get constituted as a legal case as such. The anguish over the limbo of her son's case was expressed in Beatriz's talk in spurts or small explosions, all of a sudden jolting into her quotidian preoccupations with finding work, which she felt might take her out of the depression that overcame her body and would allow her to secure a livelihood, and in spite of a livelihood beyond and in spite of the failing fast food shop that she ran with her husband and daughters. She preferred to work at night, doing janitorial work in office buildings where she could be alone and simply lose herself in the work, forget everything, she told me. While Beatriz saw me as someone who might be an extra-local broker of sorts, providing her with contacts to lawyers who might take up her case, as I did with Martita, she seemed to avoid the topic of finding different lawyers for her son's case, instead registering her discontent with stories of corruption between lawyers, the public prosecutor, and the police. As I spent more time in Beatriz's house, however, a whole other context started to reveal itself, one that Beatriz did not relate to me directly until much later. As we sat around in the evening with Martita and Beatriz's daughters and granddaughter Vivi, sharing gossip of the neighborhood, playing with the grandchildren, talking about romance and the betrayals of men, Beatriz would be called away with her cell phone, just answering, dígame, like, talk to me, and leaving the room. Other times, Ana would answer the cell phone and tell her mother that El Guatón, like this is like basically the nickname, was calling, and Beatriz immediately picked up and left. I began to sense that Beatriz, as well as her family, were carefully bounding that which would stay within the domestic and those intimacies which could enter into talk with me. It was Martita, however, who, in a moment of frustration with Beatriz for not pressing the law clinic on the status of her son's legal case, related to me in the car on the way back home from their house, quote, "I shouldn't tell you this because it is not my place to tell you, but let me recount to you so you know who you are dealing with." And she recounted to me how Beatriz's son, Nono, her older son, was being held in preventive prison for an ongoing murder case that had been spectacularly and repeatedly covered in the media. She bitterly remarked that Beatriz took Vivi, her granddaughter, to see Nono in the prison along with Nono's 2 small children. "Why would she take the child? She has nothing to do with Nono," Martita said, preoccupied with securing a, quote, "clean existence for Vivi outside of the death-dealing and thus illegal aspect of the milieu." Martita's barbed gossip surrounded Beatriz's careful bounding off of her son's biographies and their manifestation as legal cases from each other, a boundary which she continually sought to secure in relation to the law and in relation to me, the outsider, as if the legitimacy of her son Nestor's case would be contaminated or undermined through kinship to her eldest son's Nono's murder charges. That is, that the purity of the status of the victim required by law would be compromised by the entanglement in kinship and a milieu marked by law's criminalization. For months, we both participated in a fiction of 2 biographies, with Beatriz quickly taking phone calls and stepping out of the room, using a nickname for her son, while I pretended not to notice, while noticing all the more the efforts at the bounding. At the same time, in the evening gatherings with Martita and Beatriz's family, Martita repeatedly pricked and punctured this fiction in indirect ways in my presence. Martita would mention to Beatriz in minuscule, excruciating detail the developments in her own son's legal case, Camilo. She related how the social worker had said that the mayor had a special eye for her son's case, and that he would personally see that a lawyer with weight would be appointed to her case. How through my friend, who was a human rights lawyer in the Ministry of the Interior, I had helped Martita connect with a well-reputed criminal lawyer who agreed to take up Martita's son's case pro bono. Through repeated talk of the making of the legal case, she threw barbs at what she saw as Beatriz's compromised position. "Where is Nestor's case? Clarita, can't you get Beatriz in touch with your friend?" The threat to the ordinary occurs from these repeated small barbs, draining again and again kinship of its life. It was after I accompanied Beatriz to the law clinic to discuss the legal case of her son that Beatriz expressed to me the entanglements of law and kinship in which she found herself. After an intense and confrontational meeting in which Beatriz asked to have the full file on her son's legal case in order to take it to the Ministry of Justice's Department of Human Rights, Beatriz says to me while we were driving back, "Clarita, did you know that I have a son who is in prison?" I hesitate. I'm suddenly surprised that she is speaking of her son, which has hung in the silences of my relationship to her family for several months. And I say, "I had this doubt." And she says, "It's my son Nono." "I had heard something about Nono, but I didn't know who he was," I reply. "He has called me when you've been in the house." She recounts to me how he ended up in preventive prison and that she will take me to his trial. Later that day, I accompanied Beatriz to the dentist. She came out an hour later. As we drove back to her home, she tells me that while she was under anesthesia, quote, "I left my body and arrived to heaven." It is something, how to explain it, that I had died and was in heaven. This has happened to me twice, and this was the second time. There in heaven, she saw her son Nestor. I only saw his back, and I tell him, "Son, let me see you. Tell me how you're doing." But he did not show me his face. He did not want to give me a hug. "Why are you treating me like this? I have missed you so much." He was crying, shaking, and says, "Mama, you need to take care of Nono. Leave me alone." "But son, I just saw the lawyers." But he didn't respond. I tried to touch him, but he left. Once before I dreamed with him, but he was content and tranquil. Now he turned his back on me, so I feel like shit. Are you angry with me because I have not been on top of the lawyers, because you are waiting for justice? I've suffered a lot. How could I face these lawyers when Nono is in prison? When they find out about Nono, They will think that Nestor was carrying a weapon, that he threatened the police, and this is why he was shot. And with the visits to Nono and the visits to Nono's lawyers, I just can't stay on top of the lawyers for Nestor. The body doesn't give. The body doesn't allow me to do it. I cannot conform myself that I was not there when he was dying, that I wasn't there. And she begins to quietly cry. It's inside my body. I don't know how to put it in words. Beatriz, her talk flowed into a description of her son Nono's girlfriend's dream that she recounted to Beatriz the day before. Nono visited Monica in her sleep, but Monica could not see his face. I was standing next to Monica, and she told him to hug his mother. Nono said to her, I don't want her to see me because she is going to cry a lot. I don't want her to see me. Beatriz's visit to her son in death and her son Nono's visit to his girlfriend together give expression to the bitter compromises that Beatriz has had to make with herself in relation to the hopes to pursue justice for both of her sons. Caught between the law's demarcation of the categories of the pure victim and the pure perpetrator, and the overwhelming sense, both by law enforcement and within the neighborhood itself, that crime or evil runs in the family, Beatriz receives her son's walking away as a plea to detach herself from the hopes and aspirations for justice for her dead son, to focus on the living. But this is one which she cannot yet acknowledge for herself. Okay. The uncanny domestic. While the visits with the dead and incarcerated show how kinship was caught within the mutually opposed categories of law, victim and perpetrator, and gave an opening for Beatriz to detach from her hopes in the law, for Martita, Camilo's visit revealed an uncanny domestic, one in which Camilo is not himself and she is not at home. Months passed. Camilo had visited his cousin Juan, who had recounted his dream to Martita's eldest son, saying that he had awoken with a sense of tranquility, that he had conversed with Camilo and Camilo was well, and that he was protecting and caring for his mother on earth. Together with a municipality and a human rights organization within the neighborhood that we had established in the name of Camilo, we organized a commemoration marking the first anniversary of Camilo's death. It was shortly after the commemoration that Camilo visited Martita in a dream. As she recounts, quote, I dreamed with Camilo last night. I never dream with him. Only once before I dreamt with him. So in this dream, he was in the house here, but it wasn't him. It's that it was physically him, like completely physically him, but his way of speaking, of expressing himself, everything changed. It was different. Not with this smile. He was angry. He didn't want anything to do with Anna and his daughter. More angry with Anna. I don't want to see the girl, his daughter. I say to him, but son, Anna has suffered so much for you. All of us have suffered so much. And he says, how do I see you or them suffering? I don't see you suffering. So imagine how I woke up. I felt like shit. Then she goes on, I don't know. I think that there is a message inside the dream. No one is worried about anything in that house, Anna's house, the girlfriend's house. I am not concerned so much for them, but concerned that the girl, her granddaughter, is well. This concerns me. All the time that we were running around here and there, worried about the commemoration, she was worried about Vivi, the granddaughter's birthday party. The only thing that I want is that Saturday, the day of the party, pass quickly, because I don't want to hear more about the birthday party. Everyone has to put in their part, but Marco, her eldest son, had to stop the train and say, what do you want to have, fireworks for the child? And I say, how could my son have been so blind? So blind, my son. And she's like talking to her son, right? It is that when I say that the police, the police killed my son, I also think that God took him clean. He saved him from all of the evil of this family. They were taking him to this path of delinquency, pressuring him to provide things that he could not provide. He did not have any other alternative but to end up stealing or selling drugs. This is what I saw. To harvest, one has to plant seeds. If one does not plant seeds, what does one harvest? 2 weeks later, Martita is sweeping the storefront, taking the dust out of the iron tracks on which the storefront door slides into place when the storefront is closed, sheathing the front of the house in pockmarked bulletproof metal. As she sweeps, a bullet deformed rolls out onto the ceramic floor. Was this the other bullet from the gun of the Urta? This is the anti-narcotics brigade officer. Would it match the bullet that killed Camilo? She picks it up in a cloth, as if to avoiding marking it with fingerprints, and carefully folds it into the cloth. She calls the lawyer. The act of sweeping, the house becomes doubled with a collection of forensic evidence. The house is doubled again as the crime scene. Martita is unnerved. It feels so strange that the bullet appears after her son visited her. She says, I think to myself, could it have been Camilo who left the bullet here for me to find? In her ethnography on suicide and its management in the Canadian Arctic, Lisa Stevenson relates the case of Sila, a young woman whose life is circumambulated by the stories of the dead and the suicides of friends and family. Sila relates to Stevenson a dream in which she sees her friend Linda, but though they wanted to say hi to each other, they couldn't. Stevenson asked Sila, is it that she was trying to say hi, but you couldn't? And Sila answers, I knew it was her, but it wasn't her, I don't know. For Stevenson, the words "I don't know" gesture to a whole epistemology. How do we know and what do we know about the dead? I don't know suggests that the speaker wasn't fully there, these are her words, was moving in and elsewhere that called her conviction about what she was saying into existence. It marks her ambivalence about what it means to know something and the way that ambivalence marks the contours of her subjectivity. Camilo's visit to Martita in her dream, however, does not raise to me questions of epistemology. How can he be dead if he appears in my dream? This is not an intellectual problem. How can he be dead if he appears in my dream, or what we can see, or what we can know of the dead? But rather seems to bring out the jarring existential threats of kinship in this milieu. As when Martita says, when I say that they killed my son, I think that God took my son clean, saving him from the evil of this family, in which the mark of state violence on the family is received as a divine gift, freeing him from the repeated small des in kinship, which would pull him into a life of illegality. Here at issue is not whether one knows or does not know, or bears the ambivalence of knowing or not knowing, this was him or not him, but that the visits from the dead relate the des in relations and reveal the omen of a different death, of a loss of the ordinary or the home, that is ushered forth by the recurring small barbs, crisis, and betrayal that are folded into the everyday, which as I just want to actually kind of point out here that these small barbs and crises are completely interpenetrated by state violence, right? Okay, so this is the ending, proximity, listening to echoes. Let me circle back to how stories of the dead and the anxieties of the dead might provide a plot for a life. In his writings on listening, Jean-Luc Nancy describes the sonorous in terms of a mobile or dynamic proximity, in which the self emerges not as stable or fixed, but rather through the very rebound of the sonorous. Quote, the sonorous presence is thus always within return and encounter. It returns or refers to itself, it encounters itself, or better, occurs against itself, both in opposition to and next to itself. But insofar as it does not consist in a being present there, in a stable, fixed being, yet is not elsewhere or absent, it is rather in the rebound of there, or in a setting in motion, which makes it, the sonorous place, a place of its own self, a place as relation to self, as the taking place of a self. Listening as a stretching to this sonorous presence, quote, can and must appear to us not as a metaphor for access to self, but as the reality of this access, a reality consequently indissociably mine and other, singular and plural, as much as it is material and spiritual, signifying and asignifying. Those are his words. For Nancy, the conditions of the sonorous are proximity. The sounds that he returns to again and again in his text are the first cry of the newborn that reverberates with us, or the, quote, reconstitution of the womb, in which a, quote, new instrument comes to resound, receiving from outside only sounds, which, when the day comes, will begin to echo through its cry. Proximity is pictured as giving birth to the new, that nevertheless reverberates that which surrounds it and precedes its birth, and which exists insofar as its cry reverberates in us. In listening to the echoes of a death in dreams, the reality that is mine and other is precarious, as various voices intervene to authorize the real. The stories that evoke this precarity provide in their clustering the specificity of a life that we might say lies at an angle to the constitution of the individual in the order of law. And we might think about this in terms of the apparatus of testimony, right? This is not to say that the reconstitution of the individual, qua legal subject, is not important, particularly in a milieu marked by police occupation and the disordering effects of law. But that biography, oh, I think it kind of went out. Sorry. Hello? Okay, sorry. But that biography or life story related in the order of law, right, is not the only way to relate a life or death, and that it may create its own blind spots in the very pressure to seek responses to the question, tell me what happened, or to bring that person, quote unquote, out of forgetfulness. Instead, what I have sought to describe through the dreams with the dead is the way in which the legal subject, right, in some ways the tension of the victim and the perpetrator, which appears in the aspirations for justice, is stitched together with the lethality and the labors of love that constitute kinship. Here, rather than constitute the individual protagonist, the recounting of dreams, as they resonate in the lives of proximate others, discloses those aspects of the milieu that mark the relation of the dead with the living, such that the death of the other for others can also be, in some ways, mine. Thanks. Oh, sure, yeah.
Thank you so much for that talk. It's 12:20. Why don't we try to go to 12:40? I'll try to keep this short. So if people have questions, please be concise. And if there's a lot of questions, we might start grouping them up. But let's throw it open. Does anyone have a question for our speaker? Any brave soul? Do we want someone to mic these questions or no?
You say that what this story was telling was about internalizing violence, that these women or people who were blaming themselves so much of what police had reflected on them, that injustice was being internalized by thinking that they did something wrong with them.
So actually, sorry. Yeah, I heard you. So actually, this is actually precisely in some ways what I'm writing against, because I am actually writing against the idea of a psychological picture of the victim, like in which there is this internalization of violence, in which the woman engages in modes of essentially in acts of self-sacrifice or self-castigation. That is a particular moralistic response to this. What I'm actually suggesting is that that actually the dreams are sites in which the difficulty of kinship, right, that bitter compromise of kinship actually can come to be expressed, right, and that it's these moments that we might think of as actually kind of a kind of truth to these relations, right. So this is not about actually individual victims or women who. Within the context, I think that some of the issues then kind of we do need to think about why is it that there's this is the kind of anchoring of the trauma model within studies of violence. I also need to be kind of looked at, but in fact, actually, I'm actually arguing that it is not a question of the internalization of violence and the idea of self-sacrificial mothers, right? But rather that women, in the context of kinship, are embodying very contradictory impulses within their kinship relations in relation to the aspiration for justice. And that because of the ways in which kinship is entangled with the law, and the ways in which the law operates on the basis of victim and perpetrator, right, with its own particular moralism, right? Women end up getting caught in some ways at different crossroads in relation to their kinship relations, right? And so the dream in some ways allows for a kind of expression of that difficulty, right? And that there's no resolution to this. It's not going to be, that's why the issue is not so much a question of testimony, because there is no narrative structure. There's no resolution. There's no kind of mastery that emerges from this. It's simply, in some ways, the difficulty reality. That's basically what I'm trying to show here. And, and also just that the question of the hope for justice, it's not that it's mutually, it's not that it's, I think that there needs to be a kind of more complicated thinking about this question of the claim to justice when you see the context in which women and men are actually in this neighborhood are being caught in, where the lawyers may say, or human rights lawyers may say, why don't you go the distance? Why don't you go the distance? And you should be the one kind of trying to claim your right, and claim your. But actually, when you think about what it takes to actually do that, as just in terms of the setting up this, establishing a human rights group in the neighborhood, there was a lot of concern that the women who actually put themselves forward in this, they would say, like, it's not about me. So they would say it's about the filter. It's about the fact that my kinship relations are going to be implicated in this as well, right? So if you're called to be a witness, it's not just about yourself. It's about making other people in your life vulnerable, right? So the claim to justice is always going to be within the concreteness of the world, of this world, is always going to be tethered into all of these other obligations and demands, right? So trying to a little bit complicate a kind of, what can be from an ivory tower kind of sometimes activist perspective as well, of like simply the simple claim to rights and being disappointed in those people that don't claim their rights. But it's like, there are a very different set of demands going on here, So.
Oh, did I see another hand up over there? Did you put your hand up? Yeah, this and then.
Hi, I'm from Santiago, and it's really painful and hear this story. And I have a doubt about if this case came out in the news or out of the neighborhood, or it's just a local know about the local people of this neighbor know about this case, or what? Because everyone know what means the military justice. It doesn't work very well, but I don't know. This woman blamed to someone or try to make this case public or something like that. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, that's a really important point. This particular case does burst into publicity in ways that many cases don't. Most cases do not. I think that, I think one of the issues that became clear as I was doing my field work and over the years was that it's not so much the claim, sometimes the issue is not so much even claiming of rights, even when it does burst into publicity, but that the institutions simply don't give you a hearing, right? And so, even the wider context of police violence and brutality in the poblaciones that we know have been going on for a very long time. This is not something that's like a novelty, right? But it doesn't even get addressed in human rights publications in Chile until essentially like 2015, right? And even then it's like tiny, right? We know that extrajudicial killings are happening in these neighborhoods, that they're rarely followed up. And that because, and then this is a larger question, but because of the particular way in which human rights discourse gets hooked into an idea of a particular model of politics, right, and assumes that the political must be kept apart from the criminal, the police brutality has a very difficult time entering into the discourse of human rights, because it always will be the question, were these people engaging in criminal behavior, So most of these cases actually never do come to light, right? Sometimes, often women, like the families, don't want to actually bring it to light, right? But often, even if you try, the life of the legal case, it really doesn't. It won't ever go anywhere, right? So,
I think in white, did you, are you not? You're, okay.
Thank you. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about this provocation you offered at the beginning about care in relation to politics. I think your talk helps us see how complicated that is and how fraught kinship relations can be and how sort of we can get trapped inside of a discourse of the rights framework. But given how complicated sort of these relationships of care are, how has this been helping you think about potentially more, are there ways of thinking more hopefully about these politics and care?
I mean, I'm not sure that so I guess I'm just not very, my commitment is to this world, like, you know, it's not a commitment to a hope that resides outside of it. I'm not trying to excavate something for myself. I'm trying to actually understand what the texture of hope could be in this neighborhood where there is a hope for justice, right? It might be actually divine justice, right? Or a hope, or actually even a trust in the law. So the way in which police enter into people's lives is not necessarily through, coercion, right? But actually, for example, in the cases of domestic violence, people may actually resort to the law, right? So to police, right? So it's a very complicated landscape. So I don't think that I could say that there's one, like, that we can see like there's a hopeful picture of care, like policies of care here, but rather that I think within the kind of way in which the ethics of care and the theory of justice get kind of put against each other, right? And the way in which vulnerability has a really difficult time in political theory to enter into the question of politics, right? Because oftentimes it's like, well, that which is political is that which is on the street, right? I think that trying to kind of see how politics comes into the domestic or track that is what I would try to do, right? But then, it's not like there's any kind of like hope. I mean, I think in these cases, like hope is always going to be braided with like disappointment in what is around you, right? And that actually people, the kind of, it's like this way in which home is so ephemeral, right? That is to say, it can be lost all the time, right? That people are constantly striving to kind of resecure it, but given the kind of complicated nature of kinship relations in this neighborhood and the pressures that people are under, right? There's always a sense that that's slipping away, right?
We have 8 minutes left, and I see 3 hands. So why don't we take, if you don't mind, we'll take all 3 of those together, and then.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about basically maybe positionality, but also in relation to Gil, to Katarina. So at some point, in the book, what Gil reads into Katarina's testimony gets like annoying. You're like, okay, like really all these things from piecing together, also because her mental condition is not very stable, right? You're like, you're really saying all this. So, and I wonder whether, and it looks to me like this is not at all what you're doing from the examples you gave, and I wonder whether you think it's because these are of course different interlocutors, but also your identity. So you're a woman talking to women, and he's like basically a male researcher talking to this one woman. Do you think that has any effect?
Well, I don't.
Well, let's take the other 2, because otherwise we're.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
It's over here.
Okay. Oh, hold on. Let me just write this down. Okay. No, it's good.
So, really thanks for that very beautiful photography. My question was really, you started with also saying that you would like to speak to this Asaf Bayat's encroachment of the ordinary. I was wondering whether you could more focused way speak to that in terms of what you draw out as this quiet politics here. Because it's relations, violence, kinship, you're talking, but I'm not able to see and link it to violence. And there's one more.
So thanks for the presentation, but I just have something that is always bothering me as a scholar when we are presenting about anthropology of violence and all of those great examples we get from the field as ethnographers. And then we simply critique all the empirical or all the activism that is happening on the ground because it doesn't give us the way of justice that we are imagining in theory, right? So, and this is something I'm really struggling with as an ethnographer and as a local activist and as an angry feminist in Egypt. It's like, I can't I can't just be critical about civil society and human rights and the lawyers and what they are trying to do, which is actually I'm part of, because I'm trying really to be an engaged scholar, but not only an ethnographer. And it's a frustration that I think that most of us, especially as feminists, would face. But I mean, I would love just to hear from you, what do you think about this? Because I mean, I'm hearing you being very critical about activism, or even, yes, women don't want to speak about, or have a legal case because this will complicate their relationships in their families. Or they don't want to speak about domestic violence because they are normalizing with it. But actually for us as feminists, we understand this is part of the gender rules and this is part of the social construction of patriarchy. And this is part of them being survivors, not victims. So I mean, I'm really interested just to understand regarding if you have an advice to engage scholars, what should we do and how can we speak about the divorced world we are moving through between the theoretical and the empirical? Being in a fourth wave now of feminism, but I mean, we are still dealing with societies and issues of first and second wave of feminism. Thank you.
Let's let our speaker respond. She's got a lot on the table.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just start with that last question. It's not, I think that this idea that there's such a thing as, I don't want to actually reconfirm the myth of a so-called ivory tower ethnography, where you come back and essentially parasitically create ethnography on the lives of people. That is simply not what is going on here, right? I think that the issue really is so for example, even the involvement in human rights advocacy that I am involved in that neighborhood, right? It was very interesting and actually quite painful to see that there is such a failure of institutions, right? That is to say, women were trying, both in terms of the fact that they were very worried about being involved in such advocacy for themselves, right? But also that the institutions themselves tended to rely on, for example, people, the women in the neighborhoods to even do any of the groundwork to actually follow up on other legal cases, right? So women actually, at a certain point, you start to see this way in which the women actually were, in some ways, just coming to these meetings, but in a dwindling sense of that they can't actually sustain this, right? And at one moment, so Martita, who was actually the one who founded this group, right? She is getting so angry that these other women that the neighbors are not coming to the group, right? And she's like, I can't, why didn't you show up? Why didn't you show up? And everybody always has an excuse, right? And so I'm sitting in the car with her and she says to me, she's like, oh, I don't think that this meeting is going to happen. I don't think this meeting is going to happen. And I said to her, well, and she was getting really very, very just stressed by this, right? And I say to her, well, does the meeting have to happen? It's not that it has to happen, right? And then she turns to me and she says, Clara, I was only doing this because I thought that you wanted this human rights group. And I'm like, no, and I said to her, I know I've only been running around because I thought that you actually desired this, to have this work done, for me to try to make these links, right? And, I think that, where you start to see that it's not so much a question like, oh, well, the activists can't do anything, there's no place for advocacy, right? But advocacy operates in this world, right? And that, it's not so much that the failure of the women to actually want to be committed to this, but that in some ways, life simply just crashes in on this kind of advocacy for themselves, right? And the institutions are not at all equipped to listen to them, right? So when the women had a meeting with the National Institute for Human Rights lawyers, right? They listened to the women, and the women had told them that of the fact that their sons had been killed by police. They wanted to try to get this issue of police violence on the map in terms of the discourse of human rights. This is what the women were trying to do. And we had set this up through various intermediaries, through my own network of human rights lawyers in Santiago. And after all of that nice hugging and fuzziness, affect, which is really kind of disheartening, like all of this kind of affective performance, right? Cookies and so forth. Like the lawyer writes back to me and says, that was such an amazing meeting, really, such an amazing meeting. Thank you so much for making these connections possible. But I think that the next step is to send a criminologist to this neighborhood to make sure that what the women are saying is in fact the truth, right? So the response of the institution to not even be willing to hear women's experiences was it's just amazing, right? So how do you actually deal with something like that, And this is where I think it gets back to this question of like the shift, this kind of shifting of like the slow shift of the ordinary, or the shifting norms, right? Because I don't think it's going to be through some kind of like massive movement that's actually going to actually change the norms of these institutions, right? It happens through, I think, you could actually see these tiny little ways in which, for example, like, and this is where I just wonder if the difference between like an individual lawyer actually coming into a knowledge of what's actually happening and taking it upon himself to go to the neighborhood and do these things, and I don't know if how to answer this, but in what way does that leave a mark on institutional memory, right? And so, what we saw like through the work, it just like really like dogged, like persistent work, right? Of keep going to that office, is the way in which various lawyers, young lawyers, got involved in like the neighborhood, right? But it's not clear to me, and it's like when you look at even the infrastructure for filing complaints, they're just records stacked up on walls, right? They kept asking me for like testimonies written again and again and again because they would lose them, right? So what kind of like how do these kind of the ways, the kind of involvement and participation of young lawyers and their experience actually relate to the slow shifting norms of institutions in relation to these issues? And can we say that there is a kind of slow shift in the ordinary in that respect in relation to law? But honestly, I'm not sure. Like, it's actually not clear to me. And then just like in terms of the male and female issue, like I don't want to put this into like a question of male versus female researchers, because I don't think it's really, I think it's more just a question of the kind of methodology that one takes in relation to, like, so we might say that there's a kind of, one might call this, I want to be careful. So one might see this as like the contrast as a kind of a different kind of one might say as like a masculine method, right? It's not the person, it's the method that actually, in some ways, in which the aim is to reconstitute that individual through a kind of redemptive narrative, and a narrative in which the individual is reconstituted as an act of mastery, right? So all of the kind of things that Katarina are saying, that's why I asked, like, well, what if Katarina had just been mad? Like, not that I'm not interested here in discounting her madness, right? What I find disturbing is that there needed to be a neurological condition to make that entire narrative work, right? So it wasn't, so like then her talk and then becomes validated in relation to the fact that she has a neurodegenerative disorder, right? In which she's being injected from. But what if her talk were simply mad? Could we not have actually could we not also have just acknowledged that? What if it didn't actually have a place in relation to the evidence? Does it matter, right? So I would want to actually say that it does matter, like that her words, even if it had no relation to evidence, actually matter, right? And so the method is very different here. Like I'm not going to actually say, like a criminologist would say, tell me if this is true or not. Give me forms of evidence to show me if it's true. I'm actually interested in a dream. You don't verify dreams. They don't fall under that regime of the law, right? So, but do they matter? Are they important? And I would say that they are. They're important for the women because they actually are the sites through which these difficult relations are actually being expressed, right? So it's a very different kind of method. And actually just one last little point here. I think one of the issues if you compare the two methods, one issue is that with Vita, basically what you have is the assumption that the family simply just takes on the discourse of the state. In fact, it becomes like this mini state, and like the family members become these proxy psychiatrists, right? But what I've always argued, even in the previous book, is that the family is not a mini state, right? The family is always semi-autonomous from the state. There is actually a semi-autonomous politics of the family that is interpenetrated by state politics. It is not the same as having the family members simply take up the state discourse. And I think that is actually like a conceptual, but also methodological difference that's really, really important. So
I think we're going to draw this to a close. It's 12:45. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it, especially that last burst of discussion. Fantastic and super interesting. And I think there's a ton to keep talking about over the next few days. So join me in thanking our speaker for her amazing speech.
thank you.